What happens when a man who has spent 38 years following every rule, paying every tax, and minding every bit of his business gets thrown in handcuffs on his own front porch? And what happens when the officer who did it shows up to work the very next morning and finds out the man's daughter has just been assigned to the federal building 3 blocks from his precinct? That's not a twist in a movie. That's exactly what happened to Walter Jerome Simmons on a Tuesday evening in Columbia, South Carolina, when Officer Craig Dalton decided that a 67-year-old black man standing in his own yard was suspicious enough to arrest. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, Craig Dalton's career was never going to be the same. It started the way a lot of things like this start. Quietly, without warning, and with someone doing absolutely nothing wrong. Walter Simmons was a retired high school principal. 31 years in the Columbia Unified School District. The kind of man who wore ironed shirts on weekends, kept his hedges trimmed to the inch, and knew every neighbor on Dunmore Avenue by first name. He had lived in that house for 22 years, paid it off 11 years ago. He had a small vegetable garden along the left side of the driveway that he tended every evening after dinner, tomatoes mostly, and a row of collard greens that his late wife May had planted the summer before she passed. That Tuesday evening, around 7:15 p.m., Walter was standing at the edge of his driveway talking to his neighbor Ron Ashby. Just 2 older men leaning against a fence the way older men do, talking. About nothing in particular. The price of gas, Ron's bad knee, whether the Gamecocks had a shot this season. Walter had a glass of sweet tea in one hand and a pair of gardening gloves tucked into his back pocket. That was it. That was the whole scene. A patrol car rolled slowly down Dunmore Avenue and stopped. Officer Craig Dalton had been on the force for 9 years. Not long enough to have learned patience, but long enough to have hardened into something mean and certain. He was the kind of officer who made quick decisions and wrote slow reports. The kind who believed his instincts were always right and saw every question as a challenge to his authority. His record had 3 misconduct complaints in the past 4 years. All 3 had been quietly resolved. Nothing on paper that stuck. Nothing that slowed him down. He looked out the window at Walter and Ron, and something about the scene, though it required absolutely nothing from him, bothered him. He rolled the window down. "Hey!" he called out. "What's going on over there?" Walter turned toward the car, unhurried, unbothered. "Just talking to my neighbor," he said. His voice was calm, the voice of a man who had spent decades managing teenagers and school board meetings and never once raised it unnecessarily. Dalton looked Walter up and down. "You live here?" Walter's jaw didn't tighten. "Not yet. Yes, sir. 22 years. Dalton got out of the car. Ron Ashby later told everyone who would listen that there was no reason for any of it. He said Walter didn't move, didn't reach for anything, didn't so much as step off his own driveway. But Dalton walked up like he was expecting a fight, like he'd already decided something before he even opened his door. "I need to see some ID," Dalton said. Walter blinked slowly. "For what, officer?" "I'm standing in my own yard." Dalton's voice got shorter. "I said I need to see ID. There's been complaints about suspicious activity in this neighborhood." Ron spoke up then. "Complaints from who? We've lived here for years. I'm right next door." Dalton didn't even look at him. "Sir, I'm not talking to you." Walter put his tea down carefully on the fence post, reached slowly into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, handed over his driver's license. Dalton looked at it for a long moment, longer than necessary. Then he looked back up at Walter with an expression that had nothing professional in it. "Step to the front of my vehicle," he said. Walter frowned. "Why?" "Because I said so." That was when something shifted in Walter Simmons. Not anger exactly. Not fear either. More like recognition. The kind a man develops when he has lived 67 years in this country and knows exactly what kind of moment he is standing inside of. He had been through things like this before. Not this bad, not this far, not this close to home, but he knew the shape of it. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said quietly. "I have a right to know why you're detaining me." Dalton took one step forward. "And I have the right to conduct an investigation. Now step to the front of the vehicle or I will place you under arrest for obstruction." Ron Ashby said later that he started recording right then. He was 71 years old and had never once pulled out his phone to record the police, but something about Dalton's voice made him reach into his pocket. His hands were shaking slightly as he hit the red button. Walter Simmons walked to the front of the patrol car, slow and dignified, the way a man walks when he is choosing not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. He stood there with his hands at his sides, gardening gloves still in his back pocket, and waited. Dalton ran his information. Came back clean. Of course it did. Walter Simmons had never had so much as a parking ticket, but Dalton wasn't done. "Turn. Nose around and put your hands behind your back," he said. Walter turned. "I'm sorry. You're being detained for further questioning." "On what grounds?" Walter said, and his voice was still level, remarkable considering everything, still level. Dalton grabbed his wrist. And that was when Ron Ashby said he actually took a step forward because he couldn't believe what he was watching. A 67-year-old man, a retired principal, a grandfather, being handcuffed on his own driveway, in front of his own vegetable garden, in front of the tomatoes and collard greens his dead wife had planted, while the sweet tea he'd set down on the fence post was still cold. The charge Dalton wrote up was obstruction and failure to comply. He drove Walter Simmons to the Richland County Station and processed him like he was a criminal. Walter sat in that holding room for 4 hours before his neighbor Ron was able to reach anyone. He didn't yell, didn't argue with anyone at the station. He sat with his hands folded on the table and waited with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime being patient in situations that didn't deserve it. What Dalton did not know, what nobody in that station knew yet, was that Walter's daughter had moved back to Columbia 6 days earlier, and that her first day at her new office was tomorrow morning. Her name was Camille Simmons, 34 years old, 14 months at the FBI field office in Atlanta before her transfer came through. She had requested Columbia specifically. She wanted to be closer to her father after his health scare the previous spring, a mild cardiac episode, nothing that required surgery, but enough to make her feel the distance between them more sharply than she had before. Camille had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, the kind of stillness that read as calm in a boardroom and completely unreadable in an interrogation. She had graduated top of her class from the University of South Carolina School of Law, spent 2 years as an assistant DA in Greenville before. The FBI recruited her and had in 14 months in Atlanta built a record that had earned her a commendation from her field supervisor. She was not someone who made noise. She was someone who built cases. She had been unpacking boxes in her new apartment when her phone rang. It was Ron Ashby, his voice tight and strange, stumbling through what had happened. She heard the words, "Your father in handcuffed," and I recorded it, and she stopped moving entirely. She asked Ron to send her the video. She watched it twice, standing in her kitchen surrounded by half-opened boxes, her face doing nothing that showed the thing happening underneath it. Then she called her supervisor at the new field office. At 9:47 p.m. The call lasted 11 minutes. Then, she drove to the station. Craig Dalton had no idea she was coming. He was in the break room eating a bag of pretzels and explaining to a junior officer why people in certain neighborhoods just needed a firmer hand. He used those exact words, firmer hand. The junior officer, a woman named Perkins, who had been on the job for 7 months, was nodding uncomfortably and looking for a reason to leave the room. The desk sergeant came in and said, "There's a woman out front asking about Walter Simmons. Says she's his daughter." Dalton didn't even put the pretzels down. "Send her in," he said. "I'll talk to her." She was already in the hallway by the time he got there. Camille Simmons was dressed in slacks and a dark blazer, not in uniform, not flashing anything, just standing there with her credentials in her hand and an expression on her face that Dalton would later struggle to describe to people. He said it wasn't angry, it wasn't upset. It was the kind of look, he said, that made him feel like the floor was slightly less solid than it had been a moment before. "I'm here for my father," she said. "Walter Simmons." Dalton looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "He's being processed. He was obstructing a lawful investigation." Camille looked at him the way she looked at people when she already knew the answer, and was only asking the question to establish what kind of person she was dealing with. What investigation, she asked. Dalton stiffened. A neighborhood complaint. What was the nature of the complaint? Dalton paused. A beat too long. Camille's expression didn't change. I'm going to need the call log for whatever complaint prompted this stop. I'm also going to need your body camera footage and a copy of the arrest report. Dalton blinked. Who are you exactly? She held up her credentials. FBI. And I'm his daughter. And right now I need you to tell me what lawful basis you had for placing a 67-year-old man in handcuffs in his own driveway. The break room had gone quiet. Officer Perkins was standing in the doorway, very still. Dalton's chest tightened. Look, she started. This isn't a federal matter. It might be, Camille said simply. And it will be if what I'm looking at on that video is what I think it is. Now I'm asking again, professionally, as a courtesy, what was the basis for the arrest? Dalton had spent 9 years never being asked that question in a way that made him feel like the answer actually mattered. He had given vague reasons before and people had accepted them. He had used words like suspicious and protocol and officer discretion, and nobody had pushed back hard enough to make him uncomfortable. Camille Simmons was not pushing back. She wasn't raising her voice. She was just standing in a hallway at 10:15 at night asking a question and waiting for him to give her an answer that didn't exist. The desk sergeant, an older man named Watkins, who had been at the station for 19 years, appeared from around the corner. His expression was careful. He said, Miss Simmons, your father is being released now. Paperwork is being processed. He looked at Dalton when he said it, and the look said something Dalton didn't have a response. To Walter Simmons came out from the back 17 minutes later. He had his wallet, his gardening gloves, his dignity, and a crease in his shirt from where they'd made him sit in a plastic chair for 4 hours. When he saw Camille, he stopped walking for a second, just looked at her. She crossed the lobby in 4 steps and hugged him. He patted her back twice, the way fathers do when they're trying not to let you know they needed it. Let's go home, she said quietly. He nodded. Let's go home. They walked out of the station together. Dalton watched them go from the hallway, the bag of pretzels still in his hand. The thing about Craig Dalton was that he went home that night thinking it was finished. That's the part that matters. He ate dinner, watched television, slept. His alarm went off at 6:15 the next morning, and he drove to the precinct with the radio on and no particular feeling of dread. He had not watched his own body camera footage. He had not gone back and read his own report. He had not asked himself a single question about whether what he'd done was right, because he never did. That was the pattern. That was the whole problem. By 8:30 that morning, the body cam footage from the night before had been formally requested by the Columbia FBI field office. By 9:00, Ron Ashby's video had been reviewed by Camille and her supervisor. By 9:45, a formal complaint had been filed with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, citing racially motivated detainment without probable cause, excessive escalation, and violation of constitutional rights. Dalton found out at 10:10 when his captain called him into the office. The captain's name was Harold Green. He was a compact, precise man who kept his desk immaculately organized and never showed much emotion in either direction. When Dalton walked in, Green was sitting behind the desk and not smiling. "Close the door, Dalton." Dalton closed it. Green folded his hands. "Do you know who Walter Simmons is?" Dalton sat. "Yeah, some old man who was obstructing a lawful stop." Green looked at him. "He was a principal for 31 years. He's got a citation from the city for community service. He's on the advisory board for the Columbia School District. He's also the father of Special Agent Camille Simmons, who as of yesterday morning is assigned to the federal field office on Gervais Street." Dalton's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. Green continued. "She filed a civil rights complaint this morning. DOJ is reviewing body cam footage and a third-party video recorded by the neighbor. Your report lists obstruction and failure to comply. The video shows a man standing in his own driveway with a glass of sweet tea." Dalton opened his mouth. Green held up a hand. "I need you to not say anything right now. I need you to listen." This department has 3 open misconduct reviews. We are 7 months from a city council audit. And you just handed the DOJ a case that has a video of a retired principal being handcuffed outside his own home while his neighbor records it on a phone. Do you understand the situation we are in right now? Dalton's jaw moved. I was following my instincts. Green stared at him. Your instincts. A 67-year-old man with gardening gloves in his back pocket and sweet tea in his hand. I got a call about suspicious activity. Green opened a folder. I pulled the call log. There was no call, Craig. There was no complaint. You stopped and escalated. Entirely on your own. The silence in that office was the loudest thing Dalton had felt in 9 years on the job. You're being placed on administrative leave pending the DOJ review, Green said. Effective immediately. Badge and weapons stay with me. Dalton blinked. You can't be serious. I'm not in the habit of joking about things like this. Green stood up. You are going to go to your locker, collect your personal items, and leave this building. Someone from HR will be in touch. Dalton sat there for a moment, not processing it exactly. More like feeling the solid ground he had stood on for 9 years shift under him, the same way he had heard Camille Simmons's question the night before and felt his answer go soft. He left the office without another word. The formal review took 6 weeks. Camille did not seek television coverage. She did not hold a press conference. She and her father and a civil rights attorney named Patricia Owens filed the complaint, cooperated with every investigation request, and let the process do what it was supposed to do. Walter Simmons showed up at every required meeting in an ironed shirt and answered every question in the same calm voice he had used his entire life. The voice of a man who had never needed to raise it because what he said was always worth hearing. The DOJ review found that Dalton had no documented probable cause for the stop, no record of the complaint he claimed had initiated it, and that his escalation to physical detainment was inconsistent with departmental policy and constitutional standards. The review also flagged his 3 prior misconduct complaints and noted a pattern of racially disparate enforcement in his recorded stops over the previous 2 years. Dalton was terminated. On the day the termination was announced, a reporter from the Columbia State called Camille for a comment. She paused for a moment, then said, "This wasn't about me. It wasn't about my title or my badge. My father did nothing wrong. He has never done anything wrong. He was standing in his own yard. He deserved to be treated like a human being. That's the whole story." The reporter asked if she felt justice had been served. Camille thought about Walter sitting in that plastic chair for 4 hours. She thought about Ron Ashby's shaking hands hitting the record button. She thought about the sweet tea sitting on the fence post going warm. "I think accountability happened," she said. "Justice is bigger than one case. Justice is whether this happens to the next person. That's what I'm still working on." She wasn't wrong. In the months that followed, Camille Simmons stayed at her post at the Columbia field office and, with Captain Green, who turned out to be a man genuinely interested in doing things differently, helped develop a new use of force and stop and frisk training module that was eventually adopted across Richland County. It wasn't a sweeping revolution. It was careful, methodical work, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes things quietly and permanently. Walter went back to his garden. The tomatoes had gotten overgrown in the weeks of everything, and the collard greens needed attention. He spent a Saturday morning out there with his gloves and his small trowel, and Camille sat on the front steps drinking coffee and watching him work, and neither of them said much because they didn't need to. At one point he looked up at her. "You know, I was okay," he said. "Even that night. I knew I was going to be okay." She looked at him over her mug. "I know, Daddy." He went back to the collard greens. "I just didn't want it to happen to someone who didn't have someone to call." She nodded, slowly. "Me either." That was the whole reason. Not the career, not the badge, not the authority. Just the thought of some other old man standing in some other yard with no daughter to call, nobody who knew which buttons to push, nobody who had spent 14 months learning exactly how to build a case that wouldn't fall apart. Just a man alone in a holding room waiting for the system to do right by him. That's why she had become who she was. And that's why she wasn't going anywhere. 2 months later, Walter was invited to speak at a community forum on policing and trust in Colombia. He wore his best shirt. He stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd, a mix of officers, community members, city officials, a few reporters in the back. He didn't speak loudly. He never did. "I've spent my life asking young people to believe in systems," he said. "To trust that if you do what's right, the right things happen. I've spent 31 years telling kids that their dignity matters, that they matter. And then I stood in my own driveway on a Tuesday evening and had to wonder if I'd been lying to them. The room was quiet, but I wasn't lying." He continued. "Because the system worked. Not perfectly, not fast enough, but it worked. Because enough. People in it still cared about what it was supposed to be. And because my daughter was raised to be one of those people." He paused. "Don't let anyone make you believe you don't have standing in your own life. Don't shrink. Don't apologize for asking the question. And don't ever believe that quiet dignity has no power. Because I stood in my driveway and didn't raise my voice once, and the truth still found its way out." He stepped back from the podium to applause that was real and full and came from a room full of people who needed to hear something true. In the very back row, in a dark blazer with her arms folded, Camille Simmons watched her father walk away from that microphone, and for the first time in months, let herself feel the whole weight of what had happened. Not the complaint or the termination or the review, but just this. Her father standing tall, still standing tall, after everything they had tried to take from him. She blinked, looked down, looked back up, still standing. Let this story be a reminder that a badge is not a license. Authority has a boundary, and that boundary is the law, the same law that applies to every person standing on any sidewalk, in any driveway, in front of any garden. And when someone forgets that, when they let power become an excuse for prejudice, the truth has a way of finding them. It always does. Sometimes it walks in wearing a blazer at 10:15 at night. Sometimes it shows up in a court filing. Sometimes it's a video recorded on a shaking phone by a 71-year-old neighbor who knew wrong when he saw it. Speak up. Document. Trust that the truth, given enough room, doesn't stay quiet forever. He paused.